Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's web conference, Accessibility for Outfitters and Guides Operating on Public Lands. Please note at this time all audience member lines are in a listen-only mode until the Q&A portion of the call. We will provide you with instructions on how you can ask a question at that time. And lastly, if you require any technical assistance, please send a note to the event producer. With that, I'll turn the call over to Janet Zeller. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jordan. Hello, everyone. Welcome. As Jordan said, I'm Janet Zeller. I'm the National Accessibility Program Manager for the Forest Service. I'm located in the Washington office. I manage the Forest Service Accessibility Program working across all staffs, recreation, wilderness, and engineering especially, but also other staffs as well. I'm the lead for the development and implementation of the accessibility programs and policies for our agency. I also represent the Forest Service working on accessibility issues with partners, organizations, states, and other federal agencies. And I instruct accessibility and universal design of programs and facilities at a wide range of training sessions nationally. The primary audience for this webinar are special use permit administrators, those who work with them, and permit holders who operate outfitting or guiding businesses on public lands. This webinar will address why accessibility makes sense for outfitting and guiding businesses, the accessibility responsibilities of the Forest Service and the permit holders, how to take the guesswork out of who should participate, and lots of resources. Plus, we'll have 30 minutes of live Q&A with national experts in special use permits and also accessibility to answer your questions. I plan to spend about 30 minutes on the presenting part of this webinar, and then we'll open up the phone lines for your questions for the rest of the hour. Now, I'll get started just as soon as I go through some of the important information about the accessibility of this webinar. As required by the law, this webinar is being real-time, open-captioned, today by Caption Colorado VITAC through the Federal Relay Contract. Also in accordance with the law, to ensure that any participants with limits to their vision will be aware of everything on the screen, I will read and describe key points on each of the slides, as well as provide a lot of additional information verbally. By early next week, the recording of this webinar will be posted on the Forest Service internal accessibility webpage, along with additional handouts related to this webinar. The web link at the bottom of this slide is the link to that page, and this will be on the screen during the Q&A today, too. So during this session, we're going to cover a quick overview of the responsibilities, both of the Forest Service and of the permit holder. Why are we even talking about accessibility? We'll cover that. Which laws apply, and then how to take the guesswork out of who should participate in your program. And then resources and the very important portion of this session, your questions. So let's get going. Forest Service is required to inform the permit holder of all the laws, the regulations, and policies with which they must comply, and to provide them with the information and resources they need to comply, and then to check back and make sure they have complied. For the permit holder, they're required to read and sign the agreement and then comply with all of the requirements. So let's look at what the advantages are of making a business more accessible. People with disabilities have approximately $175 million in discretionary income. That's straight from the Department of Labor. This is a market for outfitters and guides. Universal design of programs and facilities serves all visitors well. There's no downside to it. And by integrating accessibility into your business, it improves overall customer service it increases your ease with between employees and customers, and by the way, you're also complying with the law. And there are actually tax advantages for small businesses that own facilities. And tomorrow we'll be getting further into that advantage. So why is accessibility so important that we are talking about it and emphasizing it in a couple of webinars? Well, it's about the numbers. More than 57 million people have a disability. That's the largest minority in the U.S., and it's growing. It crosses all ages, races, and genders. A disability is legally defined as a substantial limitation of one or more of a person's major life activities, such as walking, seeing, hearing, breathing, thinking, and so forth. It's a long list. About 15% of disabilities are obvious. That is, the person uses a wheelchair, crutches, cane, walker, has an obvious amputation, or something else you can see at first glance. That means 85%, oops, our other slide isn't coming up. That's interesting. 85% of disabilities are unseen. The person may have a heart or breathing disorder that limits their ability to walk, limited hearing or vision, learning or thinking difficulties. The list is, oh, there it is. The list is very, very long. As I say, it's a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits an activity. There are a number of examples. A disability is also if a person has a record of having had such an impairment or is regarded as having such an impairment. But I want to be very clear, illegal drug use is not protected as a disability. You have no requirement, there's no legal requirement to involve anyone in your business as a customer who is actively involved in illegal drug activity. A person's disability also affects their family and friends. Forest Service Visitor Use Monitoring tells us that on the 193 million acres of national forests and grasslands across the U.S., we serve about 150 million recreation visitors each year. And that same surveying tells us that 8% of the groups of more than one person self-identify that at least one person in their group has a disability. So we know that today close to 12 million people with disabilities are currently recreating on the National Forest System lands. We know the public is inclusive in the way in which they recreate, families and friends involved together, people with and without disabilities recreating together. When a family member or a friend has a disability, that entire group will seek out and use only the businesses that are accessible. Add to that the fact that disability often comes with aging. The U.S. Census Bureau tells us that by the year 2030, in just 12 years, over 80 million people in the U.S. will be over 65. Keep in mind that today 1 out of every 2 people over 65 has a disability. It's clear the aging population are going to be adding to the number of people who have disabilities. We know from the Forest Service Visitor Use Monitoring that today the largest age group of people out there recreating on the public lands today are in their late 40s and in their 50s and late 50s. In 12 years, this group of very active people will be approaching 65, with disability more likely. So it makes sense to ensure your business will stay open to that market. And also, there are the legal requirements. The laws break out in 2 ways. They address programs and they address facilities. A program is the reason a person visits an area. They ride a horse, to ride horseback. That's the program. to raft or to hunt or to mountain bike or to hike. Each of those are individual programs. A facility is a structure, and what the law says is if that structure has to be entered to participate in the program inside that structure, then that structure is required to comply with the applicable accessibility standards. Now, when it comes to outfitters and guides, very often outfitters and guides have no programs inside a facility. For example, a hunting guide. They advertise their hunting guiding on the web, and people sign up on the web, and they meet people out on the national forest to guide them on a hunting trip. They have no facilities that are involved in their program. Therefore, they have no facilities that would be required to be accessible. Now, if that same hunting guide advertised online, people registered online, but as part of his service, he meets them at the airport, he drives them back to his lodge, he puts them up that night at his lodge, and then he drives them to the national forest. He has lots of facilities involved, and so lots of accessibility responsibilities. So that's the difference. If you have a facility that folks have to enter to participate in your program, then there are accessibility requirements, and we're going to talk more about that in tomorrow's webinar. If there are facilities involved, the Architectural Barriers Act requires that facilities constructed, altered, rented, or leased by, for, or on behalf of a federal agency, and that includes those facilities of outfitters and guides because you are acting on behalf of the federal agency. And there are accessibility standards for that. Much more tomorrow on that. Today we're focusing on programs, and the law that really deals with those programs is the 1973 Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and a USDA CFR that implements that. It says programs must be open to all people unless it requires a change to the program that would fundamentally alter that program if that person with a disability were to participate. But no person can be denied participation in a program unless that person doesn't meet the essential eligibility criteria applied to all. We'll get into that much more deeply in a few minutes. Now, there is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. Programs and facilities are to be accessible. All new construction is to be accessible for state and local governments and for what's called public accommodations, which are businesses open to the public. And yes, our permit holders, our partners, are businesses open to the public. However, the federal laws also apply to our permit holders and partners, and they are more stringent than the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA does not apply to federal agencies. So for all the Forest Service and other agency folks online, the ADA does not apply to you. Good news for our permit holders who are outfitters and guides, we have an accessibility guidebook for outfitters and guides operating on public lands. It's a user-friendly guidebook just for permit holders who provide the programs out on public lands. It covers the laws in clear detail, so I won't go in any further into those. It also covers lots of other helpful information, and we'll talk more about that a little later. But first, let's take a look at the big picture of programs and accessibility and how you can take the guesswork out of who should participate in your program. The law says several things, and that includes programs are not to deny participation due to the qualified person's disability. If necessary, a program is to be, quote, reasonably modified, unquote, that's what the law says, to include people with disabilities unless modifying that program would fundamentally alter that program. Keep in mind, a program is accessible if a qualified person with a disability has an equal opportunity to participate and gain the same benefits offered to all by that program or service. Programs are not required to guarantee successful participation for anyone, including for a person who has a disability. The laws require equal opportunity to try. The laws do not require exceptional opportunity to guarantee success. There is a requirement for reasonable modifications, as I just shared, to be made to rules, policies, or procedures that would otherwise deny equal access to qualified people who have disabilities. So let's look at that. It is removal of physical barriers. If you have a facility, tune in tomorrow. We'll talk more about that. Reasonable modifications to rules, policies, or procedures need to be made. Providing auxiliary aids or services for effective communication, we'll cover that. And all is to be done in an integrated setting, people with and without disabilities recreating together. No separate special programs. Now, as far as a reasonable modification of rules, policies, or procedures, here are some examples from the Department of Justice of what they consider a reasonable modification. Allowing a companion or an assistant to help a person with a disability use a public restroom designated for the opposite gender. If you are using a facility and there's just a men's room and a women's room, and, for example, there's an older couple and one has to help the other, or there's a parent with a child of another gender, then you would send someone into that one of the restrooms, check that there's no one else in there, and then allow that mixed gender couple to go in, assist while someone watches at the door. When the person comes back out, it goes back to being a single gender restroom. That the Department of Justice considers to be a reasonable modification. So it's not much, but it is trying to do something to help. Another example would be to provide a visitor using a walker or with limited use of his hands or arms, assist them to carry their bulky rental equipment to their vehicle or to the place on the site where it's used. Perhaps it's a canoe rental. Allowing a service animal in a place where animals are not typically allowed, such as an eating area, which I find a very amusing example from the Department of Justice, because that's a requirement. That's just not an individual modification. Another example of a fundamental alteration, what you would not do to a program. For example, allowing a person to use a motorboat on what was advertised as a quiet evening canoe tour, and the rest of the tour group is paddling canoes. If a person has a disability and says, well, I can't paddle a canoe, but I want to go, so I want to use a motorboat there, using that motorboat on that quiet evening canoe tour would certainly be a fundamental alteration of that experience for the rest of the group. That would be too much to do the laws with you to say, no, sorry, we can't take a motorboat with us. Auxiliary aids. Auxiliary aids are specifically, or services are specifically around effective communication. And effective simply means whatever is written or spoken must be as clear and understandable to the person who has a disability as it is to those who don't. And this would mean things like having an accessible web page. You could exchange written notes if it's just a short conversation. Other auxiliary aids or services, a qualified sign language interpreter upon prior notice, and we do other webinars that go into that. And actually, that's covered thoroughly in your accessibility guidebook for outfitters and guides. Unless an undue financial burden would result or a fundamental alteration, You cannot charge the person who has a disability, and there are resources that you can find out about through your local independent living centers. Integrated setting programs are to be so that everyone with and without a disability is recreating together and not separate or segregated programs. Even if another provider offers the same program and it is accessible, you cannot send you cannot send a qualified person with a disability to that program, even if the person wants to participate in your program. They probably want to participate in your program because that's where their friends and family are. Now, we've been talking about a qualified person with a disability. So what does that mean? A qualified person with a disability is a person who has a disability and who meets the essential eligibility criteria or requirements for that program or service or activity without a modification to the program that would fundamentally alter that program. A person is not to be asked if they have a disability or any information about their disability. That's a big caution. And remember what I shared with you early on, 85% of people who have disabilities don't look like they do. So that's a firm do not ask. And that's one more reason why essential eligibility criteria is so important. Essential eligibility criteria, or EEC, and we go very much into depth in the Accessibility Guidebook about the EEC process. But I'm just going to give you a sort of a quick overview here. Programs are to be open to all people who meet the essential eligibility criteria for participating in the program, and that criteria is always based on safety, on risk management. The EEC must be the same for all people, and it has to be applied to each person seeking to participate in that program. So what's the point of EEC? It takes the guesswork out of who should participate. It continues to provide excellent customer service and helps permit holders cut their chances of being sued because you have turned away someone because of their disability. Anyone can participate who meets the safety-based criteria for participation in that program. This is not new. It's been with us since 1973, and it's not changing. It is also under the ADA for outfitters and guides who have competition who are not on federal lands and under federal permits. The purpose of the legal requirement is to establish who can participate in an activity based on the person's ability to perform the essential skills required in that activity, focused on risk management considerations. Can you fulfill the requirements to avoid the most common causes of injury in that activity? It's to give you and your potential participants the information needed to objectively evaluate if they have the ability to participate. You're striving for a good fit for all your program participants. Here's an example of a possible basic EEC for a guided whitewater float trip. Each participant must be able to tolerate water between X and X degrees, you know what it would be in your area, and bright sunlight for X minutes or more, whatever fits your particular area, and have the ability to follow verbal and or visual instructions. Notice it doesn't say hear the instructions. That would be considered discriminatory language. Each participant must wear all protective equipment recommended or required, enter and exit the raft independently or with the assistance of a companion, remain seated and balanced with the use of adaptive equipment if necessary, Adaptive equipment must not inhibit a wet exit. In the event of a capsize, each person must have the ability to independently get out from under the watercraft, remain face up in the water with the aid of a life jacket, and make progress to the shoreline. For rentals, at least one person in the watercraft must have the ability to move it through the water in a stable manner and return it to the rental area. For trips including overnight camping, mobility about the campsite independently or with the assistance of a companion. And companion means it's a person who comes with them. If it's a summer camp and you have staff working with youth, then staff would be expected to assist. But if it's not that scenario, then you can expect that the person brings with them the person who will assist them. So who writes the EEC for the program? The program operator does, because no one knows the program better than they do. So how do you know that the EEC is correct? Ask yourself why each of the criteria is necessary. Does it address the documentable safety risk in that management criteria? Can those reasons be explained to someone else? Bottom line, do you think you could explain to a judge exactly why that is an essential criteria to participate in that program? That's interesting. Keeps dropping off. And you can also check your EEC with your permit administrator, Forest Service Accessibility Coordinator, to ensure there's non-discriminatory language. You can also check your EEC with your legal counsel, as is appropriate, permit holders, legal counsel. Let's see. Moving on. The EEC must be written. It should list in order of activity the basic physical thinking abilities needed to participate, focus on those risk management issues, and consider what a person must be able to do to avoid the most common causes of injury. Include if a companion can assist. You notice in the example I gave you, when it came to in the event of a capsize, there was no companion assistance there, because each person is going to have to fend for themselves in that case. Include rules, required etiquette, use non-discriminatory language, and then edit the whole thing for simplicity and review it. And then you've got to apply it to each potential participant. You don't just pull it out when someone with an obvious disability comes in. That's a short trip to court. EEC must be posted clearly where the area's information is posted, on websites, brochures, and apply to all potential participants. It's a reality check for folks. If your brochure shows happy people on a sunny day cruising down the river in a raft, people don't necessarily realize that there could be an overturn of that raft. By reading through the EEC, they better understand what they're getting themselves into, and you want folks to be prepared before that happens out on the river itself. So that's one of the great values to EEC. As I say, there is the Accessibility Guidebook for outfitters and guides. We also have one for ski areas operating on public lands. And these do go into they focus on the programs in accessibility versus on facilities. And they provide guidance, and they use a quality customer service approach, not a compliance approach. This is about how to improve one's business opportunities. And it provides lots of details, and it also provides a ton of frequently asked questions. Accessibility resources for you. We have the National Public Accessibility webpage. That is public-facing so that our outfitters and guides can go there and download that accessibility guidebook. It was not printed in hard copy. The only way to get it is to download it. So we encourage folks to do that. We also encourage Forest Service permit holders to share that information and that link with their permittees. There is an internal site, Forest Service folks. That is where you can go to get that information and lots more, as well as where you can go to get this webinar. And there's a date correction for this next piece. We're going to be talking about permit holders with facilities and accessibility. It's not next week. It's tomorrow on the 7th. You can trust the email that you got about that. If you don't know who your regional accessibility coordinator is, Forest Service folks, these are your regional accessibility coordinators. So take note and make a connection with them. They are going to be a huge help to you as you work with your permit holders. So we've gone through this. Whoops, there's an error on that. Let's open up the lines, Jordan, for questions.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, you can press #2 on your telephone keypad. That will put you into our verbal question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line gets unmuted, and at that point, you'll be able to state your name and question. And one last time, that's #2 to enter the verbal question queue.
Great. Thank you. Well, excuse me, while we're waiting for our first questions to come in, I want to introduce the folks who are with us. Karen O'Leary, our Recreation Special Use Program Manager. Delighted to have you with us, Karen. Hello.
Thank you, Janet. This is Karen, and I am based in the Yates Building in Washington, D.C., and folks that know me are beginning to hear that I'm retiring at the end of the month. So if anybody has any questions, be sure to get them to me before then.
Ask her fast. It will be a great loss when we see you off into retirement, but we wish you well, Karen.
Thank you.
Next up, Jonathan Cook-Fisher is ill today, so he is not able to be with us. But we do have with us Ben Johnson. He's our Rec Special Uses Program Lead. Ben?
Yeah, hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. And we are definitely sad to see Karen go at the end of the month, but Jonathan and I are here to keep answering questions and help folks out as needed.
Great. Thank you. Okay. We're waiting for our first questions to come through. And while we're doing that, I'm going to swing back to the correct page, except for the fact that the date on the next webinar is incorrect, so that you can take note of those web links. Let's see. Karen and Ben, is there anything particular that you want to talk about, cover in relation to outfitters and guides?
Yeah, I'll bring up one thing. You mentioned the guidebooks, and those guidebooks are very well written. They've got nice pictures. It's a wonderful document. They're also available by PDF, and if you've got new permit holders or just permit holders that you know would benefit from those, be sure to just email them those PDFs. They're to share, so make them freely available to people.
I appreciate that, Karen. They are really well laid out. They're real page turners. The pictures keep taking you right on. There are pictures on every page. And these are photos that were provided by Forest Service permit holders. And it shows folks in the field, folks with obvious disabilities, some without obvious disabilities, but they're there as a resource for you. So do make use of them. Any questions yet, Jordan?
Yes, we have 2 questions on the phone lines right now. We'll go to the first one. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello.
Hi, this is Andrea Tavigi on the Huron-Manistee in Michigan. I had a question about a few slides back you had mentioned reasonable accommodations not having an undue financial burden. And I'm just wondering how that's defined, because for smaller operators, doing something like hiring an interpreter would be an undue financial burden, but for a huge outfitter guide, maybe it wouldn't be. So at what level is that considered undue?
That's an excellent question, Andrea. I appreciate it. And I do want to clarify one thing. It's not a reasonable accommodation. And the reason I highlight that is a reasonable accommodation is only an employment. And what that means is that one-to-one, you will do whatever is necessary for that person to fulfill the essential functions of their job. A reasonable modification is a lighter standard, as you could see by the examples of what constituted a Department of Justice acceptable modifications of policies and procedures by those examples that I gave. And so it's not as heavy a hammer as reasonable accommodation. But when it comes to a sign language interpreter, and there have to be two if it's for more than 30 minutes, that can be very expensive. The break point varies with the outfitter guide. If it's a small business, then they're going to have a lower financial total finances in their business, and it would be a negative impact on that bottom line very quickly, likely. Whereas, as you shared, a very large business has a very different bottom line. It's tough to figure out there's no magic percentage, et cetera. It's really a case by case, and in those cases, the permit administrator and the permit holder needs to look at the reasonability of it. And I'm sorry that we don't have a cleaner answer for you. Does that help?
It does. So I think what I'm hearing from you is basically whatever the decision is, it needs to pass the red face test. So if it's an extra $1,000
well
for $100 trip, doesn't make sense. But if it's an extra $20 for somebody who's paying $500 for the trip, that would make sense.
Exactly.
Okay,
well, and not only for what they're paying for the trip, but what the bottom line resources are. If it's a multi-million-dollar corporation that's running, as a subset, these various opportunities. And I will share with you that there is a very large company that is an outfitter and that is an outfitting store, a national brand, who was dealing with this exact issue because they ran their own programs. However, the budget line for those programs was not that of the multi-million-dollar corporation. And they took that to the Department of Justice, and there is an 800 number for the Department of Justice for technical assistance. And basically what they will do is they will try to help you interpret how something fits into the law. It is not legally sustainable in that you can't take that as a quote into court, etc., but they are a good sounding board. And they did go to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice said, sorry, the way you break out your budget is not what's impacted by the law. It's the bottom line of your corporation. And so for them, the standard was much higher. And it did not break down to the per cost per trip. It was the company, its bottom line would not be negatively impacted, therefore they would have to do it.
Thank you very much.
Any follow-up on that? You all set?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks. And Jordan, we had another call?
Yes, we actually have two more left on the line. We'll go to the first of those. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello.
Hi, this is Paul Schilke on the Carson National Forest. I have a question, and it looks like it'll really be more pertinent to the next webinar on March 14th with permit holders and facilities.
And actually, it's not the 14th. It's tomorrow.
It's tomorrow.
That's an error. It's tomorrow.
Should I just wait, or should I ask
time.
my question anyway?
Well, if it's facilities and you're going to be able to be on, why don't we do it tomorrow?
What time is that tomorrow? Is it again at 2 o'clock Eastern?
Same time. Same time.
I'll wait till tomorrow. Maybe you'll answer it tomorrow.
Okay. But there is a different call-in and login. So
very good. I'll wait till then.
Okay, send me an email, and I will ensure that you have that correct connection.
Very good.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Yes, tomorrow we'll be on facilities, but please do not look at March 14th there. It is now March 7th that the facilities piece is going to be on tomorrow. That's an error on the slide. We have another question, you said, Jordan?
Yes, we do. Going to them now. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello.
Hello, this is Tom. Yes. Hello, this is Tommy Sky on the San Isabel National Forest. And some.
Great. Hi, Tommy.
Hi. Some programs will have sort of like a health screening or kind of thing that they'll have you fill out. And if someone has a disability.
Medical information.
Yeah,
right.
Medical information, and they leave that off. I mean, is that okay for them since you're not supposed to ask, or are they supposed to include that information of their disability?
They are supposed to include it because your medical information sheet will say very specifically all information will be used to ensure that you have a better trip. I will tell you that in the Accessibility Guidebook, we go in depth into medical information and what you can and can't ask. And it was written by a doctor who teaches wilderness medicine, etc. And it has been vetted by a number of attorneys as well and risk management specialists. So I would strongly encourage you to look at the Accessibility Guidebook and read that section. Absolutely, you may ask for medical information. The key is you ask for the same information of every participant. What you have to be careful of is not to just ask certain questions of someone you think might have a disability. The problem for outfitters and guides is always that people might not fully disclose because they're afraid that they can't go on the trip if the outfitter knows that they have a certain disability. And that's why the way in which it's phrased, and I don't have that on the top of my head, it is carefully laid out in the Outfitter and Guide book. The way you phrase why you are gathering this information is very important, and the confidentiality of that information is also very important. And so the other piece is that, pardon, go ahead.
So if you ask a group of people, is there any kind of medical condition or are you allergic to, there's something, to give them that opportunity to
it would be better not to ask. Well, it's better not to ask a group and ask people to put their hand up because then you're asking them to declare in front of everyone else. This should be something that is give everyone a form or something like that so that people can deal with it individually and then they can be quickly screened through. It's a real problem on day trips because you don't have the luxury of planning ahead and getting all of your information ahead of time. But
yeah, that's what I was thinking of, those sort of quick situations where someone, something happens real quick. They come up, and they're doing the trip right then and there. That's where I guess, it can be more challenging.
And it is. And as I recall, the doctor also dealt with that issue, that it is the most difficult. But the thing that you've got to remember is that people, when they're among strangers, they're not likely to put up their hand about something that is different about themselves. That's just human nature. And so you have to be really careful as to giving them an opportunity to speak separately, even if you announce it to the group and then make yourself available in an inconspicuous way that folks can come to you separately.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tommy.
And
then,
one more
Karen?
on the line at this time.
No more, did you say?
One more.
One more, great. Hello?
Please go ahead.
Hi, this is
Hello?
Begin again.
Great.
Hi. So I had an additional question that popped into my head. In a past life, I used to give interpretive guided tours, canoe tours for the Park Service, and translating that to something that might happen on a national forest now, a particular incident I'm thinking of is there was a couple who didn't speak a single word of English that at the time I was not comfortable taking on the tour for safety reasons, so I denied them the ability to go on the tour. Is it fair for an outfitter guide to make that requirement of people to say, yes, you must follow verbal instructions in English? Because for safety's sake, if you have to give quick instructions on the water, that seems reasonable to me, but are there any restrictions to something like that?
Well, the requirement is verbal or visual because there are people who cannot hear, and you would immediately be closing out anyone who is deaf, or many people who are hard of hearing who don't admit that they can't hear that well and they've missed the directions. So it's often very important to have some way to visually share, whether it is passing out procedures that are laid out graphically so that you can show, for example, wet exits or things like that when you're dealing with a water environment. Ben, Karen, other thoughts?
Yes, there's a limited English proficiency direction, and I don't have that in front of me, and I'm not that familiar with it, but it does apply to our special uses program. I will see what I can come up with there and distribute that through our PDL.
Oh, that'd be great. Would you include me on that? Well, it's not a disability, not speaking English, but only speaking other languages. I see a great relation to the folks who are unable to communicate verbally.
Yep, I'll make sure you're included. Thanks, Janet.
Thank you. See, Karen's just full of good things. Andrea, that isn't a clean answer, but more to come. How's that?
Sounds good. And I realize it's not so much a disability question, but definitely could be put in that category of discriminating against someone with a different.
It certainly could.
But it does
very
seem
easily
like a huge safety issue if you're talking about spur of the moment decisions that could be life or death. It seems like it would be reasonable to require folks to speak whatever language that the instructions are being given in, because you're not going to have time to pass out a brochure if your raft capsizes.
No, and that would be the pre-work. That would be the group safety talk at the beginning before you got out on the water versus trying to deal with it on the water.
True.
So this is Karen again, and for those outfitter guides that deal with high numbers of foreign visitors or other people who speak other languages, they often have some of those safety talks translated into their native language and have that available to people. And that's something you can do pre-trip. Like you said, you're not going to be passing it out as you're having some kind of accident out there. But, if you have sizable numbers of people, it would pay to have your outfitter guides have that translated. And there's services that will do that for you.
Yes, and Toby Bloom with our Interpretation and Tourism program has some very good connections with a variety of other companies. I know that Gray Towers has been translating. They have put put together booklets that cover all of their building tours and grounds tours, and they then had them translated so that when many of their visitors arrive who do not speak English and their guides only speak English, and so they can give folks this to follow along, and it has pictures of the various areas so they can move with the group and they can read what the interpreter is saying about that particular area. And so, and that was done through these connections that Toby Bloom has. So I will for the posting of this webinar, I will put with it information about that translation services. I'll connect with Toby and get that out there for you. So you will find that on the internal web page, and it will be posted with this webinar by early next week. So that should help everyone. Making myself a note here. Good. All right. Good thinking, Karen. Thank you. Do we have any other questions, Jordan?
No other questions at this time. Actually, it looks like we just got one in. Apologies, it just went away. So with that, I don't think there are any other questions at this time.
Well, even if you were, I do want to say to you all, you have great resources for special uses on this phone. This does not have to be only an accessibility question. If you've got a special uses question, you've got the golden team here. So please feel free to ask it. Don't limit yourself to accessibility.
What?
That wasn't in the brief.
Going to make you work too. Yes. No, but you're great resources right here. So if you've got something, don't parse it out. Oh, I don't know if that's accessibility enough to ask. Just go ahead and ask it, and we've got the resources here to answer it. Now, I will tell you that if no one asks questions, we will end the webinar. So if you have one just in the back of your mind, go ahead and ask it.
We did just get one question in here.
Great.
Caller, please go ahead.
I'm
Hello.
So sorry, guys. This is Andrea again.
That's fine, Andrea. You're asking great questions.
You opened it up, so here's an open question. It does have to do with accessibility, but it's a little more facilities related. If you have a real-world example on our forest, we have an org camp that we're trying to get under permit, and all of the facilities were built prior to the ADA. They were built back in the 60s and 70s.
You need to be tuning in tomorrow. Because we're going to go in detail into those things tomorrow, Andrea. I put off Paul. I should put off you, too.
Okay,
can you stand to wait? Or?
I can.
Okay. Do you have the login information for tomorrow?
I do not.
Oh, my goodness. You didn't get that? You got it for today, but you didn't get it for tomorrow. It was in the reminder note. If you got the reminder note, if you scrolled on down, they were both in there. If it said reminder in the email that you got. But anyone who's on who did not get that notice as to the login information for tomorrow, please send me an email, and I will ensure that you get it directly, because we do want you back on for tomorrow if you have facilities involved. We split this out into two because the program is big enough on its own and facilities are big enough on their own that it's really a double webinar, and we usually put a week between them. But due to some scheduling difficulties that Karen and Ben and Jonathan have with next week, we had to put them both into this week. So do send me an email. It's just jzeller, Z-E-L-L-E-R, at the usual, fs.fed.us. Okay. Well, any other questions, Jordan?
Yes, we did have one question come in during that response, so we'll go to that caller now. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello.
Caller, it's possible your own phone is on mute.
Sorry. This is Maria Page. I'm at the two questions. First off, will your PowerPoint be available after this webinar?
Not the PowerPoint per se, but the recording will be. And the reason I do that is because, you know, I added a lot of information verbally. And if people just have the PowerPoint and don't get the rest of the information, they're not getting the full story. So, as I say, there will be the recording will be online, and you can pull the recording off. You can save that separately, put it on a USB, and do whatever you want with it. So it will be there that way, but I don't share the PowerPoint separately because, unfortunately, in the past we've had some misunderstandings develop because people didn't have the rest of the story.
Okay, thank you. And I do have a second question, and perhaps maybe for the other special uses folks. In the process of putting a prospectus out there, would a guide proponent who offers guiding services exclusively to folks with disability, would his application be judged or looked at any different than any other application that came through in respect that he's sort of serving an underserved population?
This is Janet. I'm going to jump in on that one and say no. It's not an advantage.
Okay.
It should be equal opportunity. And I would hope that he didn't serve it exclusively because folks like to recreate with their family and friends. And so
sure.
I would hope that it would be people with disabilities and their family and friends. So I just jumped in on that one. Ben and Karen?
You want to take that one, Ben?
Yeah, I'm with Janet. And I think you could just fall back on the prospectus evaluation criteria if they get questions.
And our permits all include non-discrimination language in the terms and conditions in the permit. So that would be key to those kinds of applications.
Okay. We've been asked over the years by outfitters, well, if I serve population of people with disabilities, I should get more permits for a particular river or this or that because I'm serving an underserved population, and that is not equitable. That goes back to the slide that said it's equal opportunity for everyone. It's not exceptional opportunity. So you don't get an extra opportunity whether you're the outfitter or the participant.
Thank you.
But great question. Thank you, Maureen. We're just about out of time now. We've run up to the end of the time. If you have other questions, feel free to join in tomorrow. We'll be dealing with facility questions, but if there are leftover program questions, feel free to do that. Also, remember your regional accessibility coordinators. They can be a great help to you. And there is Ben and Karen and myself. We're always glad to answer questions, too. Karen and Ben, any final comments?
Nope, it was a great webinar, and I love the questions. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everyone, for chiming in today.
Well, we'll be back tomorrow talking about facilities, so please join us then. And, Jordan, that completes this webinar.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for joining us. The conference is now concluded, and you may now disconnect.